prepare for these calls, do a little bit of homework. And since we took a little time off at the end of the year, so I better freshen up on everything and make sure I'm not missing anything. And I did. But I was like, whoa, there is a lot going on. And one thing I want to address for listeners and our subscribers, people can say, and it's, it's a fair question. Well, hey, you're a financial newsletter, you make recommendations, you analyze the economy, et cetera. That is what we do. Why would you be talking about politics? And the answer is that today, it's been true for a while, but it's more true than ever. The politics and the economics are so closely intertwined that you cannot do a good economic forecast. You cannot do a good market forecast without understanding what's going on the political front. You may love Trump or hate Trump. You may love Biden or hate Biden. I leave that to every individual, pick your candidate, but they could not be more different. There, maybe there'll be a few surprises, but I think more on the Democratic side than the Republican side. Maybe there's some candidate other than Biden at the end of the day. Maybe talk about that a little bit, but the difference is huge. And I know that every political analysts, they're all over, MSNBC and CNBC and CNN. There's, Fox News. You get a steady diet of them, and basically all of them say, they have views on all this stuff, but you have to really dig down and get past the partisanship and get past. I have opinions on everything, but opinions don't matter. Analysis does. And that's what we focus on, is the analysis and the empirics behind it and what's actually going on. One thing I will say is that going back to September, when we did an issue on this in strategic intelligence, I said I expected Biden would not be the nominee, that he would go through the primary process, collect a bunch of delegates. That seems pretty clear, maybe enough to secure the nomination. But at some key date in probably May 2024, if I had to pick a day, he would announce that he was not seeking the nomination. Now, to be clear, he would not resign as president. He would remain president to the end of his term in January 2025, but would not seek the nomination. Very similar to what Lyndon Johnson did in 1968, although that was March. And everyone says, well, what about all the delegates? They're all pledged to Biden. They are, but Biden can release them. And I think that's an important thing. Not that many people are familiar with the actual delegate process on the Democratic side, but Biden can release those delegates, number one. Number two, the Democrats have invented this concept of the super delegate. What's a super delegate? Well, super delegate are that they don't get voted in; they get handpicked. They're party leaders, county chairs, state chairs, some politicians. They're basically the hardcore of the Democratic activists, Democratic Party members, and they just get picked by the leadership. So the Democrats are they don't have a lot to run on right now, but they're running on this idea that and they say it explicitly. This is not me being hyperbolic. This is what the Democrats are saying, that Donald Trump is Hitler and Donald Trump's a dictator and all this kind of nonsense, and he's a threat to democracy, and we the Democrats are the party of democratic process and democracy generally. The facts are the exact opposite. In other words, why do you have 1/3 of your convention delegates handpicked, not elected by the voters? And in the scenario I was describing, if Biden drops out, the superdelegates can get together the same day. Of course, this will all be orchestrated behind the scenes, and say, okay, and the superdelegates are coalescing around, fill in the blank. Gavin Newsom is a name you hear a lot, but there are a few others. Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. Jennifer Granholm is the Secretary of Energy, but a former governor of Michigan. I don't know what's up with Michigan, but they seem to produce their share of progressive governors. Can't rule out Jay Pritzker, although maybe he crashed and burned a little bit. With Penny Pritzker, his sister is the head of the Harvard Corporation, who kind of bungled this Claudine Gray situation. So who knows how that plays out. There's also an Epstein angle, there always is. So maybe we kind of downgrade him a little bit. But there are at least 3 or 4 solid candidates that they could turn to. But yeah, Gavin Newsom's the most likely. And then they would go from there and then the delegates that Biden releases would take their cue from the super delegates, and then they would go along, and you would have a convention in August, at which point they nominate Gavin Newsom, who never ran. And this is my point. We're the party of democracy, and Trump's the party of dictatorship. but they actually, the Democrats are the ones who are not following the democratic process. And there are many examples. There are two candidates who announced they're running against Biden in the Democratic primaries. Pardon me, Michelle Williamson is one, and there's another. There's a member. Is a Democratic member of Congress. I'm sorry, I don't know his name off the top of my head. He's not a big factor, but he's a legitimate politician who did the paperwork and said, "I'm going to run. I'm going to contest Biden in the Democratic primaries." And maybe neither one of them is more than 1 or 2% in the polls. I'm not saying it's a big factor, but the Democrats have kicked him off the ballot. Said, no, sorry, you can't run. We control the process, state parties, Democratic National Committee, et cetera. They've already kicked RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., out of the Democratic Party. I mean, who's more Democratic than the Kennedys? The Kennedy family name is practically synonymous with the Democratic Party, going all the way back to the 1950s, when John F. Kennedy was a senator before he was nominated for president and beyond, obviously. So, and he's a much more serious opponent. We'll talk a little bit more about him because he's going the third party route because the Democrats have kicked him out. The Democrats didn't like the fact that New Hampshire, by the way, I live in New Hampshire, so I'm pretty close to the politics here. The Democrats wanted to rig the primary calendar so that the South Carolina primary would be ahead of the New Hampshire primary. And the reason is pretty obvious. You go back to 2020, how did Biden do in New Hampshire? He finished fifth, like not second, not third. He finished fifth. He was behind, it was Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren, I think Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders. Then Biden was fifth, and everyone was writing him off. He goes to South Carolina and he wins. And then he never looked back. Biden just kind of ran the table from there. But that's because the South Carolina primary was very much rigged in his favor, because of Big Jim Clyburn and the black vote and getting the ministers out, and there was a lot to it. When I say rigged, I'm not saying that they printed fake ballots and none of that. I'm just saying that the whole thing was set up for Biden to win. Well, they said, well, that worked. Let's do it again. But they didn't reckon with the fact that New Hampshire, the reason New Hampshire is the first primary in the country is not because they feel like it. It's actually, well, they do, but it's actually in the state statute. It's a law in New Hampshire. And New Hampshire has a Republican governor, and Republicans control both chambers of the state legislature. So you're not going to get them to back off. The Republicans are like, no, we're running our primary first in the country. That's what our law says. The heck with you. So the Democratic Party response, the Democratic National Committee says, fine, do what you want, but we're not going to participate. Joe Biden is not on the ballot in the New Hampshire primary. He's not running. They kicked everybody else off. It's kind of, there might be you might be able to get a Democratic ballot, but there's not going to be anyone to vote for. And they've already said if you write in RFK Jr., they're going to discard it, not count it, obviously. So when I look at how they rigged the New Hampshire primary, how they tried to push South Carolina ahead, how they're going to possibly use the superdelegates to pick Gavin Newsom without Gavin Newsom having to get a single vote. And there are more examples I could give, but tell me who's the party of non-democratic methods? Who's the party that's trying to destroy democracy? Well, it looks like the Democrats, based on everything I just said, and there's more kind of behind that. Having said all of that, and when I issue forecasts, I'm particularly in the political realm, economics, sometimes we have a more higher confidence level, but in politics, I always say, hey, here's where things stand today. Here's how it looks. Here's the analysis. You can be the judge. But I always say, hey, this is going to change. I promise you it will change because the landscape changes. It's just the nature of politics. Right now, I'm leaning a little more to the view that maybe Biden's actually going to go for it. Maybe he's going to go all the way and not drop out. He doesn't have to. I mean, it's no matter what the party says, if they rig it so that he's the nominee and the expectation that he'll drop out, and he throws him a curveball and doesn't drop out and goes all the way, well, there you are. It's Biden-Harris again against probably Trump and, well, it won't be Pence. We know that, but some vice presidential candidate. So that I'm kind of putting that back into play. The reason mainly has to do with Biden's criminal liability. He's going to need some pardons, and if he steps aside and Gavin Newsom is the nominee or Gretchen Whitmer or whoever, and they lose and Trump wins, which seems likely from where we sit today, Trump's not going to pardon Biden. I mean, he's going to put him in jail. So that's not going to happen. And Biden knows that. So Biden would actually, one scenario would be actually resign, not just withdraw as a candidate, but resign as president for health reasons or whatever. And then Kamala Harris becomes the president, maybe just for a couple months, but just long enough to pardon Biden and the Biden crime family, which is, kind of a replay of what Gerald Ford did when he pardoned Richard Nixon in 1974. So, although Nixon was his crimes were not nearly as bad as what Biden has done, but that's we'll leave that for the presidential historians. But Biden may not want to roll the dice on that. He may not think that's the way to go out. He may just run for second term expecting to win. There's nothing in the polls, nothing in the economy, nothing in any analysis that says Biden should win. But that doesn't mean he doesn't think he can win, because he did win the last time. So we'll watch that very closely. But that's another kind of wild card in the deck, which Biden might see this all the way through. Now, what I want to do, I want to kind of break the discussion into two parts. We're going to have an economic part at the end, and we have some Q&A, but just to kind of move along, I just want to go through the calendar, and I've got like 40 dates. I'm not going to read 40 dates. I'm just going to hit the highlights, but I want our listeners to know kind of what they should be looking for. And this stuff is upon us. I mean, it's early January, but this stuff is coming, I think, faster than a lot of people realize. So the first big date is actually today, January 9th. The Congress comes back into session. They've been away. That's why you haven't heard much about them, but they'll be back, and they've got a full plate. So the Washington news cycle is going to dial up extensively. Then January 15th are the Iowa caucuses. Here, again, the Democrat side doesn't matter. It's all rigged for Biden, so you can, rent a movie from Netflix if you care about Biden. But on the Republican side, it's more meaningful. This is Ron DeSantis's big play. Now, just to be clear, Trump has compiled a lead in the polls in every, not just nationally, but in every state for the Republican nomination that no one's ever seen before. It's one thing to be 10 points ahead, which is huge, 5 points ahead, which is still comfortable. But to be 30 or 40 points ahead, which Trump is, no one's ever seen anything like it. So don't take anything I say as an indication that Trump's not going to be the nominee, because he is going to be the nominee. But there's some people haven't given up on that. I read one thing that was kind of interesting. It's like, why aren't the Democrats doing more to support Gavin Newsom? The answer is they're supporting Nikki Haley. They think that you can't explicitly support Newsom without stabbing Biden in the back, but they want to promote Nikki Haley as the alternative to Trump. Maybe they think they can beat her. I don't know. But Ron DeSantis is still around. His campaign's been a disappointment. That's fair to say. But he looks like it may be a number two in Iowa. But Iowa's going to be Ron DeSantis's Waterloo. He's either going to finish number two and lay claim to that and roll into New Hampshire, or not. If he finishes third, he might even have to, wrap it up. Chris Christie's a joke. He's like a pompous blowhard, but he's still out there. He might drop out after Iowa. Who knows? But DeSantis is going to give it a good shot. Now, January 23rd is the New Hampshire primary. This is where Nikki Haley has put her bets. Some polls show her running close to Trump. No one's ahead of Trump, but if you come out of New Hampshire, and I'll just kind of give you an estimate. It's not a forecast, by the way, who knows? But if Trump is like 48, 49%, and Nikki Haley comes in at like 40%, I mean, she's not going to win, but if she can get as close as nine percentage points, that's going to be a huge boost for her. She's immediately going to be the credible alternative, and it's going to make it harder for all the other candidates. Vivek Ramaswamy still in it, but he's faded a little bit. So it really is DeSantis and Nikki Haley, and New Hampshire might be Nikki Haley's high water mark, and we'll see how that goes. But having said that, Nikki Haley blundered recently, like in a way you can't even believe. She was doing a town hall, and somebody asked her, what was the cause of the Civil War? You know, I don't know if it's a history lesson in the town hall, but of course, Nikki Haley's from South Carolina. She was the governor of South Carolina, and South Carolina is where the Civil War began at Fort Sumter. Those were the first shots that were fired. So it wasn't a totally unfair question. And she goes on and on about, oh, the North was supporting civil, not even civil rights, like human rights and liberty, and kind of reciting the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and all this stuff. Went on and on for minutes, never mentioned the word slavery, never mentioned the word slavery, which was the cause of the Civil War. I mean, yeah, there were other issues, states' rights and all that, but states' rights was kind of a cover for pro-slavery. That's what the states wanted to do. So how do you're from South Carolina, you're the former governor, you're in South Carolina, and your answer to the Civil War doesn't mention the word slavery. So everyone's like, okay, you're just a dope, or maybe you're, not what we think you are. So she hurt herself, and Trump got a pickup. So we'll see what happens in New Hampshire, but that's her high water mark. But neither one of these are really going to matter. Now, when I say not matter, it'll affect the news cycle, but it's not going to slow down Trump. Now, I mentioned January 15th, Iowa caucuses, January 23rd, New Hampshire primary, in between January 19th. What's that? That's the first deadline on the government shutdown. Now, I'm pivoting to economics a little bit, but trying to get through the calendar. So we had a government shutdown scheduled for what would have been midnight, September 30th, 2023. That's when the government's fiscal year ends. Kevin McCarthy was trying to finesse this, continuing resolution, CR, which everyone hates. You pass this and say, keep spending what you're spending. We're not approving any new programs, but we're not ending any old programs. Keep spending what you're spending, and we'll get back to you. And then they have these omnibus bills where they take everything and sweep it into one giant $2 trillion expenditure and vote on it. That's the way the Congress has been operating for years. The Republicans in the House, the Freedom Caucus in particular, and some hard shell conservatives, including Matt Gaetz, who doesn't mind pulling the pin on a hand grenade, said, no, this is over. And they kicked out Kevin McCarthy. And after a couple of weeks of turmoil, we got Michael Johnson as the Speaker of the House. And they got the continuing resolution done. They kind of had to, but they said, we're breaking into two parts. One expires January 19th. Now, the thing about two parts, you don't shut down the whole government. You only shut down half the government. I don't know how that works exactly, but the affected agencies are Department of Agriculture, Transportation, Energy, might be important, Veterans Affairs, Housing and Urban Development, Food and Drug Administration. So those agencies run out of funding, and they all got to stay home on January 19th if they can't come up with a compromise. And candidly, the House is divided internally, and the House and the Senate are divided without regard to party. I mean, the Republicans in the Senate look more and more like Democrats, and the Republicans in the House are taking more and more of a hard line. So I'm not sure we could have a shutdown on January 19th. Bear in mind, this is like right in the middle of the political season, which I mentioned Iowa and New Hampshire. So January 31st, we have a Fed meeting. This is a little bit away. We'll talk about that more. But then February 2nd is part 2 of the funding deadline. I said they broke it into 2 parts. February 2nd is much more momentous because this involves the Defense Department and most of the other federal agencies that I didn't already mention. Now, what's up with the Defense Department? It's like, hey, national defense, national security, surely they're not going to shut down the Defense Department. Well, they might, and here's why. Biden wants $60 billion for Ukraine. Every day that goes by, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on the Ukraine war. I've spent a lot of time on it in the past 2 years, so I think our readers are very well informed. Russia's winning. They're winning decisively. Don't believe what you read in the New York Times or the Financial Times or the Economist or the Washington Post. It's all garbage. They've gone from, remember, last May and last June 4th in particular, this is the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The Ukrainians are going to, attack. They're going to go to the Sea of Azov. They're going to take over Mariupol and other cities. They're going to cut off the Russian supply lines to Crimea. And they're going to go, if you believe some versions, they were going to march all the way to Moscow. It was always nonsense. The reality was worse than anyone could imagine from the Ukrainian point of view. The Bradley fighting vehicles, the Challenger tanks, the Leopard tanks, all these wonder weapons, Storm Shadow missiles, they all got blown up through Russian minefields, air power drones, radar. The HIMARS artillery didn't work because the Russians could jam the GPS systems. The shells were kind of landing harmlessly in farms because they couldn't get their bearings to hit the target, etc. Don't want to spend a lot more time on that. It got so bad that the Pentagon actually delivered some Abrams tanks. That's our top of the line US tank. And they called the Ukrainians and said, please don't use them because they're just going to get blown up on the battlefield. We don't want pictures of burning Abrams tanks. It's kind of bad for morale and bad for sales. So that was a complete failure. Now the narrative is, okay, the offensive failed, but it's a stalemate. It's not a stalemate. The Russians are advancing in Avdiivka, Bakhmut. There's a place called Chasiv Yar, which the Russians never took in the Battle of Bakhmut last spring, which is over the end of May. Now they're encircling Chasiv Yar. They're moving in north in Kupiansk. I mentioned Avdiivka. The Russians are moving across the entire front. Now, here's the thing people don't understand about Russian warfighting. They take their time. This is not flashy. This is not Tommy Franks marching to Baghdad. This is not the kind of thing that Americans have come to expect. This looks like World War II. This looks like the Battle of Kursk. This is how the Russians beat the Germans. And the Germans killed 5 million Russians. They did, but then the Russians showed up with 5 million more and killed 4 million Germans, and then kept going all the way to Berlin. But it took 2 years, and or a little more actually, more like 3 years. But the point is, the Russians will just grind you down, run up your casualties, deplete your ammunition. That's all happening. The UK is out of ammunition. I mean, they have the Navy and the Air Force are fine, but they're not very involved. Sorry for the interruption there. As I was saying, the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force are fine, but but they're not very involved. It's the Army and the artillery and the land forces, et cetera, and they're just out of ammunition. So is the United States. We've taken it from South Korea, Israel, et cetera. So basically, Russia is going to win decisively in Ukraine, and that's just going to be another, fiasco for the Biden foreign policy record. Top of Afghanistan and what's going on in Gaza and a lot else. All that is playing out as background in terms of what we're talking about. So then let me spend a couple minutes. So I'm going to jump ahead. July 15th is the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. I'm kind of skipping over the primary season, but that'll pretty much be over by March for the Super Tuesday. And it'll be Trump and Biden as of now, if Biden doesn't step aside. And then July 15th, Republican National Convention. It'll be a Trump coronation. Just be a big party in Milwaukee, but not much intrigue. Then, and I'm looking forward to this, August 18th to 22nd is the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Well, you got to be a certain age to remember the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. I remember it very well. I was in high school and I was always a political junkie, and I followed it very closely. And the Democrats were in power. Lyndon Johnson was the president. Hubert Humphrey was going to be the nominee. He was the vice president. It should have been theirs to lose, but they tore themselves apart. Now, at that time, it was about the Vietnam War. But this time, it's going to be on a couple of issues, but probably number one is Palestine. The Israelis have returned some armor fighting vehicles and tanks to Israel. They've scaled down a little bit, but not really. And they've still got the ground forces and the intelligence, and they still have the air power, and they're still going after the leadership. They killed the number 2 Hamas leader in Beirut the other day. They figured out where he was with some associates, just blew up the hotel. The Israelis are very good at that. We're seeing, kind of seeing escalation there, but the anti-Semitic, anti-Israel element is not coming from the Republicans. It's coming from the Democrats, and it's torn the party apart. And by the way, it's one of many factors. I could list 20, but one of many factors that's going to cost Biden the election, because the largest concentration of Arabs in the United States, some illegal, but mostly legal actually, is in Detroit. It's like compared to 1910, the Italians and the Irish were in Lower East Side. Well, today the Arabs are in Detroit. That's where you get Rashid Taleb, I believe her name is. She's the congresswoman, pretty extreme radical. Um, but the point is, this pro-Palestinian anti-Semitic element in the Democratic Party is huge, and they're saying they're not going to vote for Trump. Forget that. They're saying they'll stay home, or maybe vote for a third party. Who knows? But they're not voting for Biden. I follow the news pretty closely, particularly New York. My favorite paper is the New York Post. They actually have better reporting than the New York Times. But they've been ripping up New York with these pro-Palestinian demonstrations. They shut down JFK twice, JFK Airport. Can you imagine at Christmas Eve, you're trying to make it to your family gathering in Denver or Colorado or Florida or someplace, and the Palestinians are out there shutting down the highway, the Van Wyck Expressway or the access road to JFK Airport. There were people getting out of their cars and their Ubers, their taxis and their Ubers, and walking with their roller suitcases to the airport miles in the rain because they couldn't make it to the terminal. Not a way to make a lot of friends. Well, if they're doing that on holiday in New York, and they were doing it in LA also, you can only imagine what they're planning in Chicago. And don't underestimate what's going on behind the scenes. There's like a small army of rented protesters, activists, agitators, and they're violent. A lot of them are violent. We saw it in Portland and Seattle and elsewhere during the George Floyd riots in July, August 2020. But these people literally get orders and they get on a bus or a plane or whatever, and they go to where they're needed, and they show up, and they got the signs printed, and they're all in like vans, and they hand them out. The idea these people are home with crayons, filling out these signs is nonsense. They're all professionally printed, made to look hand letters, so you think there's some effort behind it, but this is very organized and can be very violent. So, and the mayor of Chicago, it's not Richard Daley. Richard Daley was like a kind of a fascist. He crushed the demonstrators, and that's why there was violence in the streets. But the mayor of Chicago today is probably on the side of the protesters. So this could get totally out of control. Anyway, it'll be good entertainment. The Olympics will be going on, but the Democratic convention might actually be better. So then, of course, we come all the way up to election day. By the way, there's a whole debate schedule. I have the debate schedule. There might not be any debates. I mean, Biden can't debate. He's physically incompetent, mentally incompetent, and Trump doesn't want to debate because he's like, why should I? So they might just skip the debates, and November 5th is election day. So you got a wild calendar. Now, let me spend a minute on Trump's legal problems, because these are, I could say it's a different schedule than the political schedule we just went through, but it's all orchestrated. In other words, all the prosecutions against Trump have been timed to interfere with the election cycle. So it's like, take everything we just said about, primaries and conventions and government shutdowns, and mention that whole calendar. That's daunting enough in terms of things that could throw the economy off the rails. But here's the kind of legal schedule. First of all, there are 5 main cases, a couple little ones, some civil cases floating around. We'll skip those. There's the Georgia case. This is Fannie Willis, the local prosecutor. Now, this is a county prosecution, state of Georgia. This is not a federal case. And that's a big deal because if Trump gets convicted, and I would say it's likely he will, if Trump gets convicted, he can't pardon himself. If he won the election and becomes president, he can't pardon himself on the Georgia case, because a president can pardon practically anyone, just anyone without qualification, on a federal charge, but he can't pardon himself on a state charge. So you're going to have to look to the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, if you want to pardon, assuming that's allowed under Georgia state law. Brian Kemp and Trump hate each other, because this all goes back to 2020, when Trump was supposedly on the phone asking the governor and the secretary of state to, find a few votes, no different than what Joe Kennedy did in 1960. But anyway, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. There's a classified documents case. This is the raid on Mar-a-Lago, going back last year, 2023. But that wasn't just like a knock and here's the warrant. They actually sent a SWAT team in and basically busted into Trump's house, kind of shocking, and ran all over the place and seized computers. And cell phones, whatever they could get their hands on, and safes and storage areas, et cetera, et cetera. Now, everyone says that Trump took classified documents from the White House. There were some sensitive matters involved, some involving North Korea. It's not clear to me that Trump just didn't want some trophies or his trophy case, like a nice letter from Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un as the head of North Korea, et cetera. A couple of things there. The president has an unqualified power to declassify anything he wants, anytime. So it's not clear that they are classified documents. If Trump said, I'm declassifying them. Now you can get into a fight over did he write that down, but it kind of doesn't matter. If the president says it's unclassified, it's unclassified. That's one of the things you get to do as commander in chief. So that's the one thing they're going to fight about. And then how damaging was this stuff really? And then did they have, probable cause under the warrant? Why couldn't they just, why didn't they raid Joe Biden's house? Joe Biden had classified documents. By the way, every president has classified documents. They all do. Whether they take care of them, whether they're sensitive, whether they, go through the formalities of declassification. I don't know. I've had a, long portion of my career at the CIA. I can't even tell you how careful I was with classified documents. It was the only time my hand would shake. I was like, I better make sure this ends up in the burn bag or the shredder or whatever, because I was so concerned about just accidentally screwing things up, and I never did. But here they just took them. So now that's the background, and it's a criminal case. It's in the federal courts in Florida. This is the only judge in any of these cases who might be a little pro-Trump. She was a judge, Eileen Cannon, was appointed by Trump. She's had some favorable rulings so far, but that case is moving forward. This is one where they want to get it on the calendar. Let me see if I have that case on the calendar here. They want to get this case on the calendar, like right in the middle. Yeah, that's right, May 20th. So May 20th is the scheduled date for the Trump trial in Florida. That's the case we're talking about. We'll see what happens. There's a lot of motion practice here. Now, Trump has made a motion to basically dismiss the case because these were things that happened while he was in office, and the president takes the view that the president cannot be criminally liable for official acts. That the remedy, you can have a bad president, you can have a president who breaks the law, but the remedy is impeachment. And that's what the Constitution says: high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, there's your crime. And so if the House of Representatives thinks the president committed a crime, you can impeach him. They impeached Trump twice, but that's the remedy, not a Justice Department, U.S. Attorney, criminal prosecution in federal court. So who knows if that goes forward or not? But right now, that's teed up for May 20th. Prior to that, since we're on the topic, March 25th is the trial date for the Stormy Daniels case. Remember that this is this kind of blowhard New York County prosecutor. Again, that's a state case, not a federal case. It's a New York County prosecutor alleging Trump paid hush money to Stormy Daniels. I was a corporate lawyer for decades, and without getting into detail, we settle cases all the time. Everybody does. You get a complaint, you deal with it, you investigate it, and often they get a lawyer, and often it comes down to, okay, we don't think we did anything wrong, but you disagree, we'll pay you X dollars. Everyone signed a non-disclosure agreement, life goes on. It happens all the time. And so I don't know what Trump did exactly, but the idea that you might pay money to someone in exchange for an understanding that that would be the end of it is not unusual, but somehow they've criminalized this, and that case is going forward. The other case is, this is also a criminal case. This is the January 6th case, the allegation that Trump, they don't use the word insurrection, which is interesting because that gets into this whole 14th Amendment issue, but Trump, basically committed violations, encouraged violence, encouraged a riot, etc. That case is in Washington, D.C. That is a federal case. And then there's the New York business records case. This is a civil case. This is this smart aleck judge. Just you kind of want to wipe the look off his face, but the judge in this case, this is a state court judge. Again, it's civil, not criminal, but it might be the most damaging of all, and here's why. The judge decided that Trump was liable or guilty before the case started. Like, he just made a ruling. It's on motion by the prosecution, but the prosecution said we'd like to, like to basically render what's called summary judgment, which you just say the guy lost no matter what, and that's what the judge did. So he determined Trump was liable on the first day of the case. So the entire case has been about damages. Like, okay, you're guilty. What are the damages? And that's what all the testimony is about. So according to the judge, Trump's already guilty, but the damages they're seeking, they want to revoke all of Trump's business licenses. Bear in mind, he's in the construction, property management, business, heavily regulated. They want to revoke all of his business licenses, turn all of the assets of the Trump Corporation over to a receiver, which is basically a court-appointed, trustee kind of person with authority to sell the assets, and he could begin selling the assets in an auction format. And you're like, well, wouldn't Trump get the money? Excuse me. Wouldn't Trump get the money? Well, the answer is maybe, but they want a $250 million fine on top of everything we just talked about. So they would take the assets, revoke the business licenses, sell the assets, and then hand the money over to the state of New York as a fine. This would destroy Trump's business. So that might be, and he's more worked up about that case than he is about all the other cases. So even though it's not criminal. So, and they've got that down for, let me see here. I mentioned earlier, that's in March.
March.
So yeah, sorry, March. So I don't have it handy, but yeah, it's sometime in March. But that case is going ahead. So that's a load of legal problems, and it's, like I say, they picked the jurisdictions to have the least favorable juries. They picked the days to interfere with the campaign. Again, everyone's saying Trump's a threat to democracy. Well, the real threat is what we're seeing right in front of our eyes. So this is going to basically paralyze Trump to some extent. He seems to have a lot of energy, but my expectation is he'll be convicted of something. And I'm not being glib when I say that. With that many cases pending and that many charges, something is, he'll be convicted of something. You can't get indicted on 91 things and they don't win one case. And that's going to be, then there's the question, do you go to jail? Well, sometimes if you're in jail, sorry, if you're convicted of a criminal case, they can let you stay out pending appeal. Like, you file an appeal, you post a bond. There might be some restriction. Maybe you have to wear an ankle bracelet. I don't know what, but you get to be out, free basically until the appeal is heard. But that's not automatic. That's up to the prosecutor. It's really up to the judge. And given this Georgia case in particular, which I think is the most likely to result in a criminal conviction, the judge and the prosecutor might say, no, you got to go to jail. So you might even have a situation where on election day, November 5th, 2024, we get to vote for Trump if you want to vote for Trump, and he's in jail. I don't know how that works out logistically, but I would hope that the governor of Georgia, at least in the national interest, even if he doesn't like Trump, would pardon him and get that over with, or at least they let him out pending appeal. But this, I know this sounds crazy, but this is all, I'm a lawyer, I'm a political analyst, I'm an economist. I follow this closely. Everything I'm saying is in the cards. Some of it may play out, some of it may not, but none of it is like, Star Wars science fiction episode. It's all happening. And then we gotta pivot to the economics, Frank. But just one last thing: Biden's going to get impeached. So that's not as much in the headlines because mainstream media doesn't like to talk about it, but it's going ahead. They're having the impeachment hearings. They're going to impeach him. So while Trump's fighting, criminal charges, Biden's going to be fighting charges of high crimes and misdemeanors in the House of Representatives. Biden will not be convicted in the Senate, but he will be impeached in the House, and he's got enough other problems. So we'll see how that one plays out. But it's a wild year. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that. Hopefully we've covered enough in the last 40 minutes or so to validate that. We'll be following all of it throughout the year and coming issues of strategic intelligence and our other publications. We have very good sourcing, very good analytical techniques. We will be following it closely and getting that information to you. But it is absolutely going to be a wild year. And one, maybe we just have a few minutes, Frank, but let me toss it back to you and then I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, yeah, Jim, great analysis. And one thing you said is a great case you made for an alternative view of why Biden would stay on and see his way through the election. If he resigned, he would be vulnerable to criminal charges, and the presidency kind of insulates him as far as indictments are concerned. So the longer he can stay on, the better for him personally. That's a great reason to hang on, right?
Yep.
That's something I never thought of, but it's very plausible. Um, Before we get any further, Jim, we also wanted to, since this hour goes by so quick, we wanted to give readers a brief update on the state of the markets after this Santa Claus rally that we saw in December, and stocks just moving on up. I think the Dow hit record highs. Do you see this rally fizzling out as more economic data puts a damper on things, or will markets continue this upward trend that they've been on?
Well, in the short run, the upward trend could continue, but there's very little doubt that we're certainly heading for a recession, probably a bad one. We may be in the recession right now. You don't know in real time. It's not like there's a ticker. It's like, oh, did the recession start today? That data doesn't exist, but there's enough out there to form some judgments and some inference. We might already be in a recession. Everyone says, the stock market's a leading indicator. That's not really true. Sometimes they're the last to know. Well, the Fed's the last to know, but the stock market might be second to last to know. We're looking at indicators from the bond market, from the Eurodollar market, labor statistics. The big one that came out just a few days ago, last week, which was a shocker. There's something called the JOLTS report. It's like job opening and hiring and layoffs. It's not the unemployment report that comes out once a month. We just saw how that turned out. But this JOLTS report showed that hiring just hit a wall. Now, that's not the same as layoffs. Layoffs are, I can stop hiring and then I can start firing. The firing part hasn't come yet. It's coming soon, but that's the last thing that happens. What I mean by that is if you're a business person, dry cleaner, hairdresser, restaurant, or even larger, medium-sized businesses, you don't want to fire people. You went through a lot of time and effort to hire them. They've had some training. Presumably they're doing a good job, or they wouldn't still be around. The last thing you want to do is fire your people. So when revenues start to dry up and the economy starts to turn down, you do everything else. You turn off the lights, you negotiate a lower rent, you maybe reduce some office space, cut out some Uber rides, lower you do everything you can to save expenses. Firing people is the last thing you do, and so it is not a leading indicator of economic performance. I don't know why the Fed puts so much stock in it. Yeah, you should watch it, of course, but if you see unemployment start to go up and you see layoffs start to skyrocket, which I do expect, you're already in the recession. It's too late to kind of position yourself. However, the hiring, which is the kind of the flip side of that just basically stopped. And so that's the last step before the firing. I stop hiring and then I start firing. The firing is a little bit lagged, but the hiring has hit a wall. That should be all we need to know, but we know a lot more. We know that not only get too in the weeds, some of these indicators are pretty technical, but yield curves are inverted. That means short-term rates are higher than intermediate and long-term rates. That should never be the case. It is the case sometimes, but it shouldn't be the case, because if I'm investing for longer maturities, I want a higher interest rate. I'm taking more risk. There could be inflation. There could be default. There could be a lot of things. So give me a little more interest. That's not how the markets are positioned right now. The short-term rates are really high because of the Fed, but the intermediate rates are below the short-term rates. So why is that? Why would that ever be the case? Well, it would be the case if you were expecting a recession. because let's just say, well, the 10-year note yield to maturity right now is 3.9 and change, call it 4% for a number, but it's just a little bit below 4%. And the very short term treasury bills and the 2-year notes are closer to 5%, not quite, but they're a little bit closer to 5%. So they're higher than the 10-year note rate. Well, that 4% on the 10-year note, that could look pretty sweet, 6 months from now, if that number's 2, if interest rates drop to 2% or 1.7, which I would not rule out at all, and you bought the note today and you got a 4% yield to maturity, and you also have a big capital gain on that note, you don't have to sell it, but if you did, you'd make a very substantial profit. And so that looks pretty good. So the reason longer term rates are lower is because the market expects them to go even lower in the future, which is a definite sign of recession. So combine that with the hiring hitting the wall, which I just described. There are a lot of other indicators out there. Swap spreads, that's a little too technical, but basically banks saying, I'll take a lower interest rate from a counterparty in a swap than I can get on a treasury note. Like, wait a second. The treasury has better credit than any bank in the world. Leave aside what the treasury is doing, that's a separate issue, but the treasury has better credit than any bank. So why would you take a lower rate from a bank than from the treasury? Well, the answer is that the bank's balance sheets are constrained. They're cutting lending, they're shrinking. And if you do if you buy a treasury note, it goes on your balance sheet, it takes up space on your balance sheet. Whereas if you do a swap, it doesn't, because it's off balance sheet. And so I might do a swap with a bank and take a lower rate just to avoid having to put it on my balance sheet, because I'm reducing my balance sheet and conserving capital. That's a sign of contraction. Commercial lending is down. They're just signs all over the place. They're not the ones you hear about on CNBC. CNBC is still in the soft landing, Goldilocks, happy talk mode, and so is Wall Street, because they want to sell you stocks. But I can tell you the list of technical signals that I follow and others follow keeps getting longer, and they have a much better track record of accurately predicting recessions. And so those signs are clearly in place. So we might have, well, I promise readers and listeners we'll have an interesting 2024. We have all the political turmoil we talked about, all the legal turmoil we talked about, which is not a coincidence because it's all timed to mess up the political side of things. We probably almost certainly have a recession, which could get very severe, could turn into a financial crisis, which is different than a recession. We got 2 wars in Israel and Ukraine. So have a nice year. But we'll, as I say, we will follow all of it and keep our readers informed.
Yeah, one thing you have always said that markets hate the most is uncertainty. And we have a lot of uncertainty this year on a lot of fronts, whether it's geopolitically or politically or economically. So we'll see what happens. Nice insight on what's coming down the pike. It does really seem like this market is overheated, especially with the technical indicators that you're talking about. Jim, we had some really good questions sent in for this call. Could we do a little Q&A with the subscribers before we close?
Sure, be glad to.
Okay, let's get to it. First up, Linda from Wilson, North Carolina asked, Jim, with an economic slowdown along with geopolitical tensions ramping up, what's the best allocation percentage for asset classes in general to hold in our portfolio based on this volatility?
Well, yeah, the volatility is an issue, but it could be worse than volatility. And what I mean by that is it could just be a collapsing market, down what, 30%, 50%. You don't think you can rule that's consistent with a severe recession, by the way. So that's not kind of number pulled out of thin air. So what you want is diversification. When I say that, people roll their eyes and go, "Oh, of course, we all know about diversification, et cetera." But actually, people don't know. They think that owning 20 stocks in 8 different sectors is diversified. And I make the point that's not diversified. You may have 20 stocks in 8 sectors, but you have one asset class, which is stocks, and they all go down together. Not all the time. In good times, they show some idiosyncrasy, and some are up, some are down. But when you hit a recession, they all go down together with very few exceptions. And so that's not diversified. Now, I'm not saying get out of the stock market completely. We actually like certain sectors. We like energy, we like big oil, we like defense, we like agriculture, we like natural resources, mining. Those are things you're going to need. But I think tech is heading for a fall. Consumer non-durables heading for a fall. Transportation, travel, entertainment, leisure, they're all set up for a fall. So lighten up your equity exposure selectively, increase your cash allocation. I'm not saying 100% cash, but 30% doesn't seem too high to me. The benefit of that, first of all, we could have deflation. We haven't even talked about that. That's something I'm going to cover in the next edition of Strategic Intelligence. But in deflation, the value of cash goes up. It could actually be your best performing asset. The dollar is worth more when prices are going down, because you get more for your money. So I wouldn't. Not only is cash a good way to reduce volatility, cash has no volatility. It's just cash. Stocks do, everything does. Gold, stocks, private equity, real estate, commodities, treasury notes. They can go up or down, but they all have some volatility. Cash does not. And so having an allocation of cash is a way to reduce the overall volatility of your portfolio. It kind of balances out the things that are volatile, and you kind of sleep better at night. I always recommend 10% gold. I don't recommend more than that. I mean, season to taste. If you want more, that's fine. But 10% allocation to gold will see you through a lot of things, including inflation. And we haven't even talked about the dollar and the rise of the BRICS. And we've talked about that in the past, but those issues have not gone away. There's room for real estate and income producing real estate. I'm not saying, certainly not commercial real estate. Let's be clear on that. It's too soon to get into commercial real estate, but if you have some rental properties or income producing properties, that could be, or farm properties for that matter, agricultural properties, that can be valuable, and alternatives if you're accredited investor. So there are a lot of things to do, but putting everything, when I hear people they've got 60, 70% in a couple different S&P index funds, I'm like, man, I have gold and people say, how do you sleep at night? I say, if you're 70% in equities, how do you sleep at night? Because that could be heading for a fall.
Okay. All right. Here's a geopolitical question. Christopher from Sydney, Australia asks, Jim, do you see an end to the war in Ukraine this year, and how would a ceasefire impact energy prices?
That's a really good question. As far as an end of the war is concerned, and I actually wrote a tweet about this morning and or the other day rather, and had some backup on it. The people in the West, and I'll start with the White House and certainly Biden and Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Victoria Nuland is a warmonger in the State Department, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and others. They, believe it or not, they don't understand how Russia fights. I think they must have skipped history class, but Russia runs a very slow war. They build huge fortified defenses. They back it up with huge manpower and reserves, massive artillery, air power, and then they just grind you down, as I described earlier. They're not trying to make a lightning, sail in or lightning dash for, Kiev, et cetera. And so you can call it a war of attrition. And by the way, that's what World War I was. But here's the difference. World War I was a war of attrition, but the UK, France, Belgium, and others combined had manpower and equipment and ammunition comparable to the Germans. So it was a war of attrition between two sides that were pretty evenly matched, and that's how you get 10 million dead. In World War II, it was kind of a war of attrition, except the Wehrmacht, the German army, made massive advances into Russia, but they got overextended, didn't have oil, overextended their supply lines. The Russians' favorite ally is called General Winter. Russians know how to fight in winter, others don't necessarily, or they're not prepared. But then when Russia counterattacked, and it took a couple of years, it wasn't like the next month or 6 months later. It took a couple of years. They were not in a hurry. They did these huge encirclements of not of divisions, but armies, entire armies or army groups. And then they would surround you, cut off your supply lines, and then just annihilate you. I mean, 90% casualties in some cases. And then, only when they had pretty much annihilated the fighting power of the Wehrmacht, did they start to push into Poland, and even that, and then ultimately Berlin, and even that took time. They're repeating that playbook in Ukraine. Again, I mentioned some of the towns where the Russians are advancing, but they're advancing slowly. And the Ukrainians, the smartest thing the Ukrainians could do would be fall back, build up really good defensive lines, which is what the Russians did last year, and then tough it out and try to get some peace talks going. Zelensky hasn't done that. He's offense, offense, offense. Well, okay, but if your casualties are 7-1 and your population is only 1/4 the other guy, who loses? Well, the answer is you do, because you're going to be out of manpower, and that they're getting close to that point. So the short answer is Russia's going to win the war. The U.S. and the allies, NATO. I mean, this thing is a disaster. It might be the end of NATO, because they've shown that they can't fight. I mean, all these weapons. What happened to all these? I mentioned the Challenger, the Leopard, the Abrams, the Bradley fighting vehicles, the Storm Shadow missiles, HIMARS artillery, Patriot. I mentioned it's all there. They got the stuff, and it's all been blown up or destroyed, and they're losing. So, so it kind of says NATO can't fight the Russians, which is not a surprise to me, but probably an eye opener to maybe some people in the Pentagon. But so the Russians are just going to grind them down, and the U.S. and Kiev have shown no ability to negotiate. They still have these fantasies about overthrowing Putin and dividing Russia. That's fine. You can have your fantasies, but there's a real war going on. So it might take all of 2024. We might be here a year from now when this thing is still going, but the Russians are definitely winning. As far as the sanctions are concerned, even if, and that was really the pertinent part of the question, even if Russia wins, which I expect they will, and even if there's some kind of negotiated settlement, which will be on Russian terms, by the way, Russia's going to just dictate to Ukraine what they have to do. It doesn't mean the end of the sanctions. The sanctions can stay on for years. So I think the disruption in energy markets will continue. Just a little bit of scoop. Again, this is from German sources. Who knows, right? But we might see Olaf Scholz resign as chancellor in days or weeks ahead because of his failure in Ukraine, and they've deindustrialized Germany. I mean, kind of go all the way back to 14 years of Angela Merkel shutting down their coal plants and their power plants and their nuclear plants and relying on windmills that don't work. I mean, and outsourcing manufacturing. I just bought a new German car. I like German cars, but I noticed the engine was made in Hungary. I'm okay with that. The Hungarians are smart and they have good engineers. I'm sure it is a good engine because I'm driving it. But my point being, why aren't you making the engine in Bavaria? Well, the answer is like I say, their energy costs are too high, and they've purposely deindustrialized their economy. So Germany's a mess. They're already in a recession, by the way. So I would expect the impact of the war in Ukraine to continue indefinitely, even beyond a negotiated ceasefire or some agreement of the kind, because the U.S. will just keep the sanctions in place and the disruption will continue.
Okay. Looks like we got another whole year of attrition going on for this war.
I think that's right.
One final question, Jim, to get in real quick before we close. Will from Glen Mills, Pennsylvania asked, Jim, what sectors are attractive if the dollar weakens this year due to anticipated interest rate cuts?
Well, the dollar weakening or strengthening is a big subject. I don't want to presuppose the dollar will weaken. Now, it is true right now, interest rate cuts are playing out. The dollar has come off its recent highs. The yen's a little stronger, the euro's a little stronger. So that's all true. If that were to continue, by the way, I should be clear, I don't expect that to continue. I expect the dollar to go back up. But just to take the listener's question in stride, pardon me, if the dollar were to go down, that would be inflationary from the U.S. perspective. And we kind of cut against the Fed. The Fed thinks they've won the battle against inflation. If we go into a severe recession, then the answer is, yeah, you won the battle, but you lost the war. Inflation turned to maybe deflation, which is a big subject, and you got a really bad recession. But if you see a geopolitical blow up, related to energy, which could happen any day. Straits of Hormuz, the Red Sea, Suez Canal, attack on Iran, attacks on the Houthis. There are a long list of things that could precipitate a crisis in the energy producing region that would send oil prices well over $100 a barrel. So you have this funny scenario where if the recession plays out, they could drop to $40 a barrel. But if the geopolitical sphere blows up and escalates, it could go up to $140 a barrel. So you say, which is it? Well, I was like, well, okay, tell me if you bomb Iran or not. I'll give you an answer. But the difficult part for investors right now is bear in mind that those are both possibilities. This is a very difficult market to trade. But if you want to presuppose that the dollar will go down, that tends to be inflationary, but you have to balance that against a recession. But if you have the dollar going down and a geopolitical flare-up, that's very inflationary. And that means the Fed has blundered once again.
Yeah,